Hello there, students. This is my introductory lecture to the fairy tales class, and I'm going to try to show you this from the beginning if I can get the slideshow thing to work. What is it doing? Here it is. Okay. So before I start talking about Tolkien's views on fairy tales, I want to share with you a few of my favorite books about fairy tales. Catherine Briggs's An Encyclopedia of Fairies, Hobgoblins, Brownies, Bogies, and Other Supernatural Creatures, which came out in the 1970s, is really a wealth of information about fairies. Briggs was a folklorist or collector of folklore and president of the Folklore Association from 1969 to 1972. Her book is what it says it is, and in it you can look up various supernatural figures from Herne the Hunter, who's mentioned in Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor, and features also live witness accounts, eyewitness accounts of the haunted tree that Herne haunts, goblins, Sir or King Orfeo, Melusine and mermaids, Oberon from Midsummer Night's Dream, but he's earlier than that actually, pixies, Puck or Pook, and seal maidens and selkies, among others. So this is a useful guide if you can lay hands on it. Nancy Arrowsmith's book, A Field Guide to the Little People, is another sort of encyclopedia, and it includes, well, it's mostly a survey of elves, which she says is the generic name for all little people. She says that fairies refer to elves of Celtic origin, while dwarf is a name applied to the dark elves. The Sidhe, which is spelled S-I-D-H-E, they're Irish. The Sidhe are fairies in Ireland, light elves, who are very beautiful and tall. Quote, their skin is soft, their hair long and flowing, their clothes blindingly white, unquote. Arrowsmith also includes eyewitness accounts of various sightings of these supernatural figures. She also considers the Nixie, or river woman, surely a forebear to Little Mermaid, along with sirens, leprechauns, and a kind of plethora of other types of magical beings. Maria Tater's The Annotated Classic Fairy Tales is a large book, beautifully illustrated with many of the stories we are reading. She also includes brief biographies of famous illustrators of fairy tales, which we will also be talking about this semester. Many of them are 19th century. There's the Pre-Raphaelite, for example, Edward Burne-Jones, who created beautiful paintings in a kind of style the Pre-Raphaelites thought themselves. They were 19th century, but they thought they were kind of going back to the period before Raphael, back to a kind of pristine and pure time. There's also a work by the engraver and woodcut artist Walter Crane, and I have a biography of him also on our class's site. There's another famous engraver, Gustave Doré, whose engravings for the story of Beauty and the Beast formed the basis, really, for a lot of the imagery in the film we will be seeing, La Belle et la Bête, later in the term. There's also the Danish illustrator K. Nielsen, and this is from East of the Sun and West of the Moon, which is a famous story that we will encounter sort of by the way. We're going to read a bit of it anyway in the texts that we're studying. And finally, Arthur Rackham, whose illustrations are pretty spectacular. He lives into, K. Nielsen and Arthur Rackham both lived into the 20th century. And books with these illustrations, first edition books, are worth a great deal, not only culturally, but also financially these days. Before I get on to Tolkien, that is, Jack Tolkien was his nickname, and his arguments with his best pal, C.S. Lewis, I want to talk to you a little bit about another book written by my friend Richard Firth Green. Elf Queens and Holy Friars, Fairy Beliefs, and the Medieval Church, which was published fairly recently. This provides some good background on early attitudes toward fairies and fairy lore. In his preface, Green notes that on a Trinity Sunday, sometime around the year 1400, a sermon was preached in England containing an extended denunciation of popular superstition. Palm readers, dream readers, negromancers, or practitioners of black magic, astrologers, and the makers of wax effigies were dismissed, and then the preacher turned to those who believed in fairies. So this is 1400. There are also others who say that they can see women and girls dancing by night whom they call elvish folk, and they believe that these can transform both men and women, or, leaving others in their place, carry them with them to elfland. This is the idea of the changeling, which we will encounter later in the term. All of these are mere fantasies bequeathed to them by an evil spirit. For when the devil has won over the soul of such a person to believing such things, he transforms himself otherwise, now into the form of an angel, now a man, now a woman, now other creatures, now in dances and other games. And thus, by the weak faith of their souls, such wretches are deceived. So, according to this preacher anyway, all of these fairy appearances are actually demonic. But those who believe in the aforesaid things, or stubbornly defend them or propagate them, especially when they have learned the truth, are faithless, and worse than pagans. And 4 times a year they are cursed by the Lord and the Holy Church. They should know they have forsaken the faith of Christ, betrayed their baptism, and incurred the anger and enmity of God. Now, this attack was not entirely original. There was a 14th century preacher's manual called the Fasciculus Morum, which also lists tournaments and jousting as fairy activities, which are, of course, also practiced by human beings. So fairyland, even by 1400, was regarded with a great deal of suspicion by the church. And this increases from 1400 to the 16th century to the period of the witch trials. So there are no witch trials really until about the 16th century. Joan of Arc may be considered, the trial of Joan of Arc may be considered the first witch trial, though she's not ever convicted for any kind of magical practice. You may recall she is the champion of France against the English and wins France back from the English and becomes a saint later. Anyway, vernacular culture makes remarkable efforts to adjust its beliefs to the orthodoxies of the church. Thus, we encounter fairies who swear by the Virgin Mary, who are eager to attend Mass, or who anticipate salvation on Doomsday. And you get lots and lots of these mixed kind of images in text where characters like Merlin, the magician, whose father was a demon, but his mother was a very devout Christian and becomes a nun later. You get these kind of characters throughout medieval literature. One genre that tells us a lot about fairy lore is medieval romance, which is not romance in the sense that we think of it today. Medieval romance was a literary genre. Oh, here we are, some fairies of the Serpentine. Well, I'll let you look at them for a minute. Medieval romance was a literary genre that featured heroic quests, usually in exotic places with magical encounters. There might be a damsel or damsels involved in the story, but not always. So a medieval romance was originally an adventure story. And here you see the hero slaying the dragon as various people look on. But that would be considered kind of medieval romance. Dragons, of course, did not exist, or did they? Anyway, there's a whole lot of confusion about fairies, who are usually called elves instead of fairies in medieval literature. While some fairies were small, others were human-sized, because if they were teensy, then it would have been difficult for them to have love affairs with mortals, which is one of the things that fairies apparently do. And there's a number of issues with trying to figure out what people thought about fairy lore. We've got it in the literature, though, so it's in fiction. So fiction, of course, is not fact. Um, so yeah, we have this one guy who's writing in the mid 13th century, Thomas of Cantemporary, and his book is called On the Universal Good of Bees. And for him, fairies come under the headings of wasps, cockroaches, hornets, and beetles. So he says that fairies cause tempests and bad dreams. Very strange. So he thinks of fairies as a type of insect, apparently. The incubus, probably the most widely used general scholastic term for fairy in the Middle Ages, derives etymologically from the sense of being weighed down or smothered in sleep. So this is a demon that visits people while they're dreaming. And the closest equivalent in English for this specialized sense would have been nightmare. So sometimes incubus is also identified as a fairy lover who visits women at night and impregnates them mysteriously, which is rather what happens to Merlin's mother, actually. And then there's a taxonomy or a classification about fairies supplied by John Walsh, who was a Devonshire cunning man or a wizard. He's 16th century. In 1566, he says there are three kinds of fairies. There are white fairies, green fairies, and black fairies. So that's about all we get from Walsh. So fairies, according to Richard Firth Green, are numinous social humanoid creatures widely believed to live at the fringes of the human life world and interact intermittently with human beings. In this, they differ from those solitary creatures who inhabit the wilderness, like giants, or social creatures who live among humans, like household spirits. So he is describing them as fairies, but originally they were called elves. Elves is the word in English before fairy. Fae in French is fairy. That's where that word comes from. Fairies are found from Iceland to Sicily and from the Pyrenees to the Ruhr, but the notion that Wales, Scotland, and Ireland have a particular claim on them is deeply ingrained in the consciousness of the English-speaking world. Two main factors seem to be responsible for this view. In the first place, stories concerning King Arthur, this is the she, concerning King Arthur, many of which are filled with fairy lore, have proved to be among the most enduring of all medieval legends. Since they clearly arose among Celtic speakers, particularly the Welsh, we tend instinctively to locate the source of all medieval fairy beliefs originally in Wales. Secondly, fairy traditions have survived more tenaciously in Celtic-speaking countries, most notably in Ireland, where the Sidhe still live, as far as I'm concerned. If you've been to Ireland, you may know what I mean. Since Irish fairies have a firm place in modern popular culture, we tend to assume that they preempt similar beliefs elsewhere. However, fairy beliefs of the Nordic world, particularly in Iceland, have proved to be just as long-lived. No doubt other factors, the relative prominence of Celtic scholars among English folklorists, or writers like W.B. Yeats and J.R.R. Tolkien, whose elves are Celtic, says Green, have reinforced the impression that fairies are predominantly a Celtic phenomenon. Okay, so the Sidhe are the Irish fairies who are actually descended from the Irish gods. Okay. The Icelandic writer Vladimir Hafstein, I guess his name is Valdemar Hafstein, this is all coming from Green, compares a 1,000-year-old vision in the Thedric Tharinda or Thorhalls, which must be a medieval title, of many a hill opening and every living thing, both small and large, packing its bags and moving in the face of impending Christianization, to stories of elves being displaced by new roads and housing developments in the late 20th century Iceland. So they still seem to live in 20th century Iceland, and concludes that urbanization is as anathema to modern day elves as Christianity was to their pagan forebears. So elves don't like technology or modernization. Looking at the present through the lens of the past, Hofstein sees elf belief as deeply conservative. It's rooted in nostalgia for an imagined authentic Iceland threatened by modernization. A good description of fairy belief in Iceland can be found in a 16th century account written by Odar Einarsson, the Lutheran bishop of Skalholt. He describes them this way. Some beings who live in hills close to men are more amicable and not so dangerous unless they chance to have been harmed by some kind of injury or provoked wickedness. They are invisible to us unless they wish to appear of their own volition. They know 1,000 devices and an infinite number of tricks with which they harass men in wretched ways. So they play tricks on people. But their young people are said to have a similar stature, clothing, and even way of life to that of their human neighbors, and take excessive pleasure in coupling with humans. Oh my. Examples are not lacking of a number of the rogues who are said to have impregnated women beneath the earth and had access to them at fixed times or as many times as they wished. And from time to time, the women of our land have been oppressed by these earth dwellers, that is, the elves, and innocent boys and girls and the young people and adolescents of both sexes have often been taken away, though quite a few are restored safe and sound after a number of days or sometimes after a number of weeks, but some are never seen again, and certain ones are found half alive. And that's an old tradition, really, where fairies take humans and sometimes substitute a fairy in their place. Some European traditions locate fairies in castles deep in the woods, or even in realms beneath the surface of lakes rather than underground kingdoms. But otherwise, Odar Einarsson's description conforms closely to the common understanding of the vast majority of medieval people. So we know that fairies impinge on human life in 3 ways: by playing tricks on mortals, by seducing them, or by abducting them. So we've got this very early reference to early references by 1400 and even earlier to fairies. By the 14th century, in religious writing, fairies are described either as devils or as illusions of the devil. Fairies sometimes are also said to live in palaces, in caves, in mountains, or in beautiful kind of households that shine with uncommon brightness. And we find this in several English romances, the story of Sir Orfeo, Thomas of Ercildown, and also in a story called Rainbroom. And also, as we've said, ideas about fairy lore and Christianity are often mixed. Green quotes a law case in which a woman named Marion Clark testified in 1499 that she had an uncanny healing ability that she learned, as she said, quote, from God and the Blessed Virgin and the gracious fairies. The judge asked her who the fairies might be, and Marion replied they were little people who gave her information whenever she wanted it. The judge asked her whether these little people believed in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and she replied that they believed only in the Father Almighty. He asked her if she'd ever been in heaven, and she said she had. He asked her if she had seen God in heaven, and she said she had, and he was wearing a golden mantle. She also said that by the power of the gracious fairies, she had talked with the Archangel Gabriel and St. Stephen. Obviously, this lady was a little off her nut, but somehow the fairies are conduits to God, heaven, Archangel Gabriel, and Stephen. And in some cases, the church was very lenient on those who believed in fairies. There's a 13th century text called the South English Legendary, in which it is suggested that fairies might be among those saved on Doomsday or Judgment Day. In the Scottish romance of Thomas of Ercildown, also referred to by Tolkien in his famous essays on fairy tales, Thomas meets the fairy queen, mistaking her for the Virgin Mary. There are 3 paths he might take: one to heaven, one to hell, and a 3rd path to fairyland. These passages provide evidence that some people felt that fairyland lay beyond the bounds of a conventional Christian cosmology. Green then cites the fairy tree that the Inquisitors asked the teenage champion of France, Joan of Arc, about at one of her many trials in 1431. This was located near her village of Domremy. Joan said she knew nothing about it, though one of her godmothers had claimed to see fairies dancing around the tree. The inquisitors then called several of Joan's townsfolk to testify. 9 admitted to having heard that in the old days, fairies were to be seen there. No one admitted to believing in fairies personally, probably wise before a church council, though a 44-year-old laborer named Michel Rouen did say he did not know where they had gone because they no longer visited the tree. The shapeshifter, oh, here we have the Lady of the Lake from Excalibur. Sometimes fairies are said to live in lakes. Wonder what happened there. The shapeshifter Melusine, who is one basis for the Little Mermaid, is also described in an early account. Among the many stories connected with Melusine was one that she would appear on the ramparts of the Castle Lusignan. Now, Melusine is a lady who's transformed into either a fish or a serpent a couple of times a month, and her husband has to pledge never to look at her on the days that she's bathing. But here you see him looking through that keyhole. Bad man. Okay, so historically, she was supposed to appear on the ramparts of the Castle Lusignan whenever control of the fortress was about to change hands. In the summer and fall of 1376, with Lusignan, the last remaining major English stronghold in Poitou, which is in France. The English had invaded France, as you may recall, during the 100 Years' War, claiming France as their own. The French fought back. Joan was their actual victor against the English. Anyway, getting back to Lusignan, the castle was under siege by the forces of Jean Duc de Berry, and it was reported that Melusine had appeared flying about the ramparts. Writing about this, Jean d'Arras, who's the historian, says that he had learned from the Duke himself that John Cresswell, the English castellan or castle keeper who was defending the castle, had been visited by Melusine 3 days before its surrender. At that time, he was in bed with a woman named Alexandrine, and, quote, he was never in his days so afeard, unquote. Cresswell, a grizzled old mercenary soldier, was certainly not a man to be easily frightened. A fact not lost on Alexandrine, who said, "Ha, valiant Sarsenal, how oft I have seen your mortal enemies before your presence, that never you were afeard, and now for a serpent of femininity nature, you shake for fear." Well, Green then compares medieval fairy belief with modern belief in alien abduction. However, which is surprisingly widespread. In 2012, about 1/3 of Americans were reported to believe in UFOs. Anyway, he says that alien abduction, people who believe in that, is still a minority cult. It's fringe pop culture, but fairy tale belief was central in the Middle Ages. And a second way in which medieval fairy beliefs differ from modern theories of alien abduction is yet more significant. Champions of alien abduction do not threaten the status quo. They do not threaten established society. However, people who professed belief in fairy magic, fairy lore, were seen as increasingly threatening. And by the Reformation in the early modern period, by the 16th century, practitioners of magic or professing fairy beliefs were condemned as witches and burnt at the stake, just like Joan was burned at the stake, though Joan was actually only convicted for one thing, which was cross-dressing. History is strange. All right, onward to Tolkien. I'm going to start with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a friend of Tolkien. You may know Lewis's work. Tolkien and Lewis were friends, and they were both medievalists, like me. And they both taught at Oxford University, not like me. Lewis was known for his scholarship. His books, first published in the 1930s, The Allegory of Love, A Study in Medieval Tradition, The Discarded Image, An Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Literature, and English Literature in the 16th Century, are still in print and still taught. Of course, Lewis is best known for his Narnia series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and others, with the fabulous Aslan the Lion, and for his prolific writings on Christianity. Lewis, by the way, started as an atheist, and as a Christian convert later wrote not only books, but gave speeches and also wrote plays, including the famous Screwtape Letters extolling Christianity. It was his friend, Jack Tolkien, who converted him. Tolkien himself was Catholic, and Lewis only became Church of England, so Tolkien sort of felt like he didn't quite win that one. And Lewis is often Tolkien's antagonist. He's the unnamed person in Tolkien's essay who poo-poos some of Tolkien's ideas. And you get the sense that this is an ongoing thing, that this was part of their friendship. Tolkien, on the other hand, was a linguist, and for his scholarly work, mainly concentrated on translations from Old English, Old Icelandic, and other languages. I had the sense that he mostly was making those translations for students who couldn't read Old and Middle English or didn't read it well, so that's part of his rationale. Two of his major essays are still taught and read today. One is a brilliant lecture on Beowulf, and the other is this essay on fairy tales. Tolkien is also known, as I'm sure you all know, for his fictional books The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which Tolkien illustrated himself. So he also was an illustrator. Another interesting fact about Tolkien is that the languages spoken by the dwarves and the hobbits and the elves and Lord of the Rings books were invented from real languages. So he's a linguist, so he's basing these fictional languages on real languages. When Sid, Ray, and I were editing our book, oh, here's Smaug. This is an illustration from The Hobbit. Painted, illustrated by Tolkien himself. When Sid and I were working on the medieval hero on screen, I persuaded David Sallow, who coached the actors in the movies, Lord of the Rings movies, about the pronunciation of languages to write for our book. Tolkien's Elvish languages are Quenya and Sindarin, the Dwarvish language Kudzul, and the Orcs' lingo is Aduniac. Quenya, that's the language of elves, is a form of Latin and is designed with Latin as a model. Sindarin, the other Elvish language, is Welsh. The language of the dwarves, Kuzdul, is modeled on Semitic languages, particularly reminiscent of Hebrew. The Orcs' language, Adunaic, is linked to the ancient languages of Assyria and Babylon. Other language variants spoken by characters in Lord of the Rings are Westron, which is a version of English and spoken by humans, and the dialect spoken by the horse-breeding people of Rohan is a version of Old English. So he's using his linguistic skills to write fiction. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings stories are said to have been first told by Tolkien to his 4 children as bedtime stories. So here's this wonderful picture of the 3 books, the 3 famous books, 4 famous books, with a pipe, which Tolkien was sort of like his emblem, actually, his attribute, a pair of glasses. Ah, here's the one. Yeah, so these stories were told by Tolkien to his children at night, and some of them, I think, would have had me under the bed after having really bad nightmares, but I suppose Tolkien's children were more resilient than I am. Tolkien's essay on fairy tales first appeared in a collection called Tree and Leaf. Tolkien opens his essay by talking about fairyland, saying, "I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land, full of wonder, but not of information." He then says he will address 3 themes. What are fairy stories? What is their origin? What is their use? In his initial description, Tolkien says fairies are not supernatural. Quote, "For it is man who, in contrast to fairies, supernatural, and often of diminutive stature, whereas they are natural, far more natural than he." What is Tolkien saying here? Tolkien then quotes the ballad of Thomas of Ercildown that describes the 3 roads, one to heaven, one to hell, and one to fairyland. Sir Thomas de Ercildown, by the way, was a real person who lived in the 13th century. He's also called Thomas the Rhymer and was a Scottish laird, or estate holder or lord, and a prophet from a place called Earlston or Ercildown. Like Green, Tolkien then considers the size of fairies, whom we think of now as very small. I always heard that fairies mainly originated, at least in English lore, Celtic lore, from the Irish gods, the Celtic gods, who were enormous, and as belief in fairies lessened, so did their size. Tolkien doesn't say this. This is Dr. Driver here. Tolkien says this, quote, The diminutive being, elf or fairy, is, I guess, in England, largely a sophisticated product of literary fancy. Unquote. Certainly, some of the fairies in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream are quite small, as described in the text. Then Tolkien cautions about thinking of fairy stories as stories just about fairies. He tends to think of them more expansively as stories about fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Quote, fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, the earth, and all the things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Wonderful, wonderful quotation. He then defines fairy tales like this, quote, a fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its main purpose may be, satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. Fairy may itself be most likely translated by magic, but it is magic of a peculiar mood and power at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. There is one proviso: if there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of, the magic itself, which is as good a definition as any. He then talks about the origins of fairy stories, and he says that in making fantasy, man becomes a sub-creator or an artist. I will let you read that over for yourselves. He then considers the question of children as the most likely readers of fairy stories, which, as you shall see, is not always the case. As C.S. Lewis once said, quote, someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again, unquote. That's not in Tolkien's essay, though. Section on fantasy describes our powers of imagination and the uses of metaphor, kind of the magical power of language. And then he talks about the power of creating a secondary world. So effective imaginative storytelling is itself magic. Then he takes issue with drama. He thinks drama is not particularly magical. I think this is a Tolkien beef, personally. And he's also writing before the invention of CGI and other realistic fantasy effects. So what he says is, so people who love drama may not agree with that part of the essay. He says, quote, enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside, but in its purity it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic produces or pretends to produce an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal. It remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. I don't know what you make of that. To create an imaginary secondary world that is believable is both a technique and a gift, I would say. He then talks about the skeptical friend he has. Whoops, I'm going to backspace a minute. Who is C.S. Lewis, but he's not named. About how this friend of his has said that myth and fairy story are lies. And he answers that actually, he writes a poem calling man sub-creator, the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. So it's interesting. It's an interesting poem. It's worth some contemplation. Here, Tolkien seems to suggest, among other things, that people are made in the image of their creator, who is the ultimate maker, God. But they too can be creators or makers with their God-given gifts. I would like to know more about your ideas about what Tolkien is saying here. In the essay's next section, Recovery, Escape, and Consolation, Tolkien mentions what he calls the Chestertonian perception of Morifok, and says further that Morifok is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written up in every town in this land. Now, Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton was an earlier English author who wrote the Father Brown murder mystery series and various theological works, as well as The Man Who Was Thursday, which I think everyone should read. It's a wonderful book. He was the one who noticed the Morifok effect. when things that seem ordinary, when viewed in a different light or from a different angle, seem wondrous and strange, like seeing the world while standing on your head. This was actually first noticed by Charles Dickens, the English author whose work I'm sure you know: Great Expectations, Christmas Carol, Little Dorrit, David Copperfield. Annabelle? What does Morfuck mean? I leave that to you. You'll have to figure it out. Fantasy also helps us to escape, Tolkien says, from ugly industrialization. He says that he heard a clerk of Oxenford declare that he welcomed the proximity of mass production robot factories and the roar of self-obstructive mechanical traffic because it brought his university into contact with real life. This is C.S. Lewis again, unnamed, Tolkien's friend, and Tolkien disapproves of this. He doesn't like industrialization. He doesn't like technology. The Clerk of Oxenford is a reference to Geoffrey Chaucer's Clerk from the Canterbury Tales. A student is a clerk in the Canterbury Tales, which was a work of literature that Lewis taught. Tolkien, on the other hand, is concerned with nature and its beauties rather than the wonders of technology. He says ironically, quote, "How real, how startling alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree, poor obsolete thing, and the insubstantial dream of an escapist." Clearly, Tolkien's allegiance is with the elm tree. He then refers to the Morlockian horror of factories. The Morlocks are a creation of the early science fiction author H.G. Wells for his 1895 novel The Time Machine, and are the main antagonists who capture and torment the Eloi, who are kind of children. Though this woman hardly looks like a child. Anyway, this is from a book cover of The Time Machine. Then Tolkien talks a fair amount about escapism and why escapism is a good thing. Here's H.G. Wells in his Time Machine. I thought that was a rather funny picture, so I threw it in. So Tolkien talks about how fiction can help us to escape, and how that's good, and how it can take our minds off that ultimate escape, the escape from death. And it gives us also what he calls, quote, the consolation of the happy ending. Tolkien names this eucatastrophe. That's the opposite of catastrophe. It's a happy ending. He then returns to the turn or change of mood one finds in fairy fiction, as one also finds in Shakespeare's sonnets, I would add, where the mood lightens. It picks up usually after the third quatrain, if you remember this, or in the couplet, where suddenly you know everything will be okay. Everything's going to be wonderful. Or, in Tolkien's words, the excitement that, quote, when the turn comes, there is a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart near to or accompanied by tears. He then cites some lines from The Black Bull of Norway, one of your assigned readings. And this is a Scottish fairy tale where, against all odds, the washerwoman's daughter, after years and years of suffering, is able to marry her prince. Finally, Tolkien refers to the transcendence offered by fairy stories, and he says, the Gospels of the New Testament are the greatest fairy story of them all. Quote, the Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories, unquote. And, quote, the birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality, unquote. Well, this is larger significance indeed, and I don't know if you agree with it, but Tolkien was a devout Catholic who saw God as the main creator, man as the sub-creator, and the story of Jesus as the greatest miracle story, which is, for Tolkien, also a type of magic, of fairy story. Through fantasy and the creation of fantasy, Tolkien says, people, quote, may actually assist in the multiple enrichment of creation. Bye for now. Oh, take the quiz. Take the quiz.